I realized after starting painting that for me, it fulfilled something in my soul. Like it was almost like this was worship. When I sat down with the paintbrush, it was like I could communicate with my hands. And like God has uniquely created me and designed me, and I want to put that on a canvas to communicate what's unique that God has given me so that people can see that. It's what I'm meant to do, one of the things I'm meant to do, so. I'm Leslie McCarthy, and I've been married to Jonathan McCarthy for coming up on 18 years now. Jonathan is a worship leader at the Mannheim campus. We've been here in Pennsylvania it'll be 7 years, August the 1st. I have 3 kids, 13 years old, soon to be 8 years old, and soon to be 4 years old. So we got a little bit of a spread with kids. See you later. We moved up here from North Carolina. We'd lived there for 9 years. Before North Carolina, we'd lived in Virginia. So we kind of like started in Virginia and just kept heading south. Jonathan is the one that moved our family. He got called to lead worship at LCBC, and so we kind of just uprooted and went north. I did not want to move here. It was not a good transition for me. In fact, when we were in the whole interview process, I came up here with him for one of the interviews, and it was raining. It was the end of April, and they put us up in Mannheim, and I remember looking out and just seeing gray, cold mist. What is this place? Do they even have a Target? There was nothing. So when I flew back home, I just remember thinking, I don't want to move there. In fact, I sat down with Jonathan at one point in time, and I was like, if God's calling you there, great, but God's not calling me there with you. And it was definitely a difficult transition. And we're planning our trip up here to get around Washington, D.C. before rush hour. Well, apparently rush hour is 24 hours in DC, and we got stuck on 95 for 3 hours. I had 2 kids and a dog. One of my kids had the flu. I had the flu. The dog was throwing up in the back of the car. Jonathan was in the car in front of us. His car, the air conditioner broke while we were sitting in deadlocked traffic, and I remember thinking, this is not a good sign. And I just had this overwhelming feeling of, we've just made the biggest mistake of our lives. I just want to go home, but right now I don't know where home is. And that started the hardest 2 months of my life. Jonathan got to move here and step right into the position that God had called him for. So he's working at LCBC. He has instant camaraderie going to work every day. And when he leaves the house, I remember sitting in this house that we were renting thinking, I've got nothing. And it was hard. I was running through Mannheim, and this song came on my playlist, and it was a song by Philip Phillips. It's called Home. And I so remember the lyrics as he was singing these words. They go like this. I'm just gonna read you a few of them. It says, settle down, it'll all be clear. Don't pay no mind to the demons, they fill you with fear. The trouble, it might drag you down. If you get lost, you can always be found. Just know you're not alone, because I'm gonna make this place your home. And I remember hearing those words as I ran, and it just broke me. It was like God was just talking right to me. I'm thinking, Philip, you wrote those lyrics just for me, didn't you? Because this is exactly where I am. And fast forward to this point in time, 7 years later, and I can say definitively that God has made this our home. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else right now. And it's not just that Lancaster County is our home, Mannheim is our home. Wherever God is, that's my home. And God had to bring me to that point of being okay with this. I've got a reason for you to be right where you are. There's a purpose for you here, and you're just gonna have to get to the point that you trust me. You trust my plan for you. So just settle down. I'm gonna make it clear, just trust me until I get you there. Well, hey guys. Wow. Thank you. I'll take that. It is great to be here with you today. Let me just say, bouncing off of that video, after almost 7 years of being here, I realized there are multiple Target stores in the area. You do not live in the dark ages in Lancaster County, although sometimes it does feel like Middle Earth, but it's okay. I love it. I love it here, and I am glad to be here. When they asked me to come teach this weekend, I thought about it for a long time, and as I was thinking about it, I just remember getting to that point where I was like, you know what? Yes, I'm going to come teach because it is time for some new representation up there. Yes. No. I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking the whole male-female thing, but that's not what I mean. I'm talking about some new football representation. Enough with the Eagles and the Cowboys. No, they're not. It's a Steeler nation. Yes. We will reign again. We will. I know it. Forget Antonio Brown. Anyways, moving on. That was actually, I really don't care. That was for my husband. He's the Steeler fan. I'm more of a basketball fan myself. I was kind of grafted into the Steeler Nation through marriage, so there you have it. So don't tune me out if you don't like the Steelers or you're one or two of the Cowboys fans that go to church here. Okay, now I'm digging myself a hole. All right, like I said, it is great to be here with you this weekend, today. Before I say anything else, happy Mother's Day to my mom and my mother-in-law watching online in Virginia and North Carolina. Happy Mother's Day. I wish I could be there with you, but I'm a little tied up this weekend, so I'll make it up to you sometime soon. But I am glad to be jumping in specifically in this series that we've been talking about. We've been going through the story of Esther, and Esther is the story that we read in the Old Testament of the Bible. It's a true story. It's historical. It's a short book. It's only 10 chapters long, but within those 10 chapters, there's nothing short of just an incredible story that unfolds. And even though the book bears Esther's name, it's not really her story at all. It's really God's story. And it's a story about God's providence. Providence is a big word that we've been talking about the past few weeks. So just to remind you of what providence is God setting things up so that what he wants to happen will happen. It's God arranging things and orchestrating things and moving people and events into place so that what he wants to happen will happen. Like maybe in your life you've had this question pop into your head sometimes of like, what's the purpose for this? What is my purpose? What's the reason for this? Why am I here where I am? Well, providence just means that there is a reason for it. Providence is the reason behind it. And so in case you haven't been with us, since we are talking about the story of Esther, I want to do a quick review on where we are so far, just to catch you up, because there's some who's who of Esther that you need to know. So here's the 5 people of Esther that you just need to make sure you know. First, we have, of course, Esther, Mordecai, Xerxes, Haman, and, of course, the Jewish people. Now, Esther was a Jewish orphan girl. I say orphan because her parents died when she was younger. She was adopted and raised by her much older cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai raised her as his own daughter. Esther was described as being beautiful, lovely in form. And as a result, she was picked to be essentially part of this, what it amounted to, the Persian version of The Bachelor. She's put into this contest along with thousands of other girls to see who would become the next queen of the Persian Empire. Although, make no mistake, I'm not sure this is a contest that Esther would have wanted to win. So here's our next person. We have Xerxes. He's the bachelor. He's King Xerxes, king of the Persian Empire. He had previously banished his former wife for disobeying a request that he had made of her. So he banishes her, and his advisors and his officials say, okay, now you need to have a contest to find the next queen. So whichever one you pick as your favorite, that'll be the queen. So as the story unfolds, we see that Esther became Xerxes' favorite. So he picked her to be the next queen of the Persian Empire. Well, King Xerxes had a right-hand man. We met this man last week. That would be Haman. Haman is the antagonist of the story. Haman had a problem. He was a racist. He was an anti-Semite, and he hated the Jewish people. He hated them so much, he wanted to annihilate them. But more than the Jewish people, his number one enemy just so happened to be Esther's cousin, Mordecai. He had no idea that Esther and Mordecai were related. He had no idea that Mordecai had raised Esther. He had no idea that Esther was Jewish. But he hated Mordecai, and it wasn't enough for him just to get rid of Mordecai, as bad as that would have been. He wanted to get rid of Mordecai's entire race of people, the entire Jewish race of people living within the borders of the Persian Empire. Now, to put that into a little more perspective for you, the Persian Empire during this period of time, it covered 127 provinces. I know, I'm sure that means nothing to you, because we don't talk about provinces today unless you're like Canadian, but 127 provinces means that the Persian Empire actually spanned 3 continents. This was a vast empire. So the majority of Jews alive during this period of time would have been living within the borders of the Persian Empire. So we're talking about the annihilation of potentially millions of Jews. This is a genocide. Well, Haman comes up with this plan. He decides it's a good idea. He goes to the king about it, and he convinces the king it's a good idea to get rid of these people who are living as foreigners within the Persian Empire before they rise up in rebellion against you. So the king decides, well, this sounds like a good plan. Let's go ahead and let's, pick a day for the annihilation. Haman plans a day for that. It was going to be on March 7th. The king makes a decree. He sends out this decree. The decree meant that now it was law. It was going to happen in 11 months from when the decree went out until the day of the annihilation. There's an 11-month gap. Well, news of this spreads all throughout the land. The Jews find out about it. And of course, what happens when the Jews find out about it is they go into what is described as deep mourning. Like, essentially, it was chaos. Like, they were mourning and weeping. We're told in the book of Esther that they dressed themselves in burlap and covered themselves with ashes and physically laid down mourning. They were so distraught over this news. All the Jews, that is, except for one, that was Esther. Esther at this point in time is sitting comfortably behind the walls of the palace with no idea of what is happening, no idea of what's going on, until cousin Mordecai comes in and tells her, Esther, here's what's going on with your people. You need to know this. Wake up, Esther, open your eyes, because perhaps, here comes his famous line that you've probably seen printed on coffee mugs or t-shirts or hanging in wall art somewhere, the famous line of, perhaps you've been made queen for such a time as this. That's the moment Esther's eyes were opened to God's providence working in her life. God's providence had set her up in this position of queen for such a time as this. So the next thing we find out that Esther does is she goes and she finds this quiet corner of the palace. She takes a blanket with her and a pillow, and she lays down, covers herself with the blanket, closes her eyes, curls up in the fetal position, and just prays that it would just go. Just make it go away. Just make it go away. That's not what Esther did. That's what I would have done. Or maybe if you were Esther, what you would have done is you would have said, all right, here, for such a time as this, all right, let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That is also not what Esther did, and that's where we jump into our story today, and I don't want you to miss how Esther responds. So grab a Bible from the seat in front of you and open to Esther chapter 5. That's page 386 in the Bibles in the seats. I don't want you to miss her response, because she certainly did not lay down and curl up in the fetal position, although it might have been tempting. Esther chapter 5. Before we jump into chapter 5, let's actually back up just a few verses before that into chapter 4, verse 15. So right after Mordecai says to her, Esther, wake up, perhaps such a time as this, here's her response. Okay, she says, then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Or in other words, pray for me. Pray for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. Esther says this right here, if I must die, I must die, because the law of the land was that no one went in to see the king without being summoned. If you did, and he did not approve of you being there, you would die. No questions asked. You were dead. So Esther was going to have to go to the king. She'd not been to the king, not been summoned to the king for 30 days at this point in time. She was going to have to go to the king to appeal for her life and the life of her people unsummoned. She was going to have to step in to his court not knowing if he was going to approve of her being there or not. So that's why she said, if I must die, I must die. And here's what happens. Chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, here's her moment, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Now, if I am Esther, and I am currently standing in this position, and all these relief endorphins are just washing over my entire being, and the king just offers me up to half the kingdom, you better believe I'm going to be throwing in a little something for myself. I mean, does that not make sense? I mean, this is a vast empire. What is one little vacation home in the southern Mediterranean? She's a lot better woman than what I am, because that's not what she did. Here's what she did, verse 4. And Esther replied, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly, quickly. He's hungry after a long day of doing king stuff. Quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet, and while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you want, what you really, really want." And Esther said, "I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want." I got some Spice Girls fans out there. Woo. He said, "Now tell me, you will never be able to read this again and not think of the Spice Girls." I just inserted the Spice Girls into Scripture. I'm sorry, Jesus. I'm sorry about that. Okay, where was I? Okay, verse 6. He says, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." There it is again. Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish." Here it comes. "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." Every time I read this, I find myself wanting to yell through the pages of Scripture and say, "Just tell him, Esther. What are you waiting for?" I mean, he already spared her life that day. He's already offered her twice up to half the kingdom if she wanted it. And she pauses. She waits. If you were to keep reading the rest of chapter 5 into chapter 6, you'll learn that she paused for good reason. Because God was leading her. God was guiding her to wait. Because God was not done that very night setting up things and orchestrating things and arranging things so that what he wanted to happen would end up happening. God's providence was still working. And because Esther was listening to God leading in her life, she paused and she waited and planned a second banquet. I cannot even imagine how terrifying this must have been for her. I mean, this is not like going into your boss at work and asking for a raise. This is a life or death situation. But Esther wasn't given any details. She had no idea where she would land on the other side of this. All she was told is that perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. I mean, she didn't know when, where, how, or even if God would save the Jewish people. She just knew she was stepping out with no turning back. She was stepping out in what she had right in front of her. Because where Esther was in the meantime. That's today. Today is what I like to refer to as the meantime. It's the here and now, the present moment. Another way of saying it is the meantime is the setting things up period of time. It's the gap between what we hope God will do and what he does. This is where Esther lived. She lived in that gap. She hoped God would save the Jewish people, but she had no idea if he actually would or not. God was setting things up while Esther lived in that gap. You and I, just like Esther, We live in the meantime. We live in that gap. We have what is right in front of us. Esther was not handed the keys to the future. We are not handed the keys to the future. We live in the meantime. And of course, our meantime doesn't look like Esther's. We don't have to worry about going into work tomorrow morning and whether or not our boss is going to approve of us being there and hold out a gold scepter or not. Our meantime looks a lot different. So maybe you have noticed this giant letter U that's been sitting on the stage today. Well, this U just kind of represents, just think of it like this way. It's like two mountain peaks up here, two tops of the mountain, and then down in between there's like a valley here. Well, some of you would describe your meantime as like you were on this mountaintop. Like if somebody were to say, how is your today? How is your right now? You would say, life is good. Everything's good. I mean, you might even be sporting a t-shirt that says life is good, those t-shirts. But then there's others of you that if like somebody were to ask you to describe your meantime, that gap that you were living in, you'd say, you know what? Honestly, it's a struggle. It's tough. Every day I wake up and I find myself just having a difficult time. Maybe you're a student, and your meantime is that you're in school right now and you're having a hard time with school, with friends. You just find every single day going to school, you're just finding feelings of anxiousness and worry as you're walking into school. It's a hard time. Or maybe your meantime is that your marriage is in trouble. I mean, if somebody were to ask you to describe your marriage relationship right now in the meantime, you would say, you know what, I can't even be in the same room with my spouse without getting into an argument. That's what your meantime looks like. Or maybe some of you wake up and your meantime, you would describe it as just lonely. Every day you're fighting these overwhelming feelings of loneliness for one reason or another. Whether it's because you're watching your friends get married and getting engaged and you're still trying to find the one and you're just finding yourself just lonely. Or you've moved to a new city, to a new place where you don't know anybody and you're not even sure they have a Target. And you're just lonely. That's how you would describe your meantime. Moms, since it's Mother's Day and I'm a mom and I feel like I can speak into this a little bit, I just want to talk to you just for a second. How would you describe your meantime with your kids? I know you love your kids. That's not a question. I know you love your kids, but if somebody were to say, describe your meantime to me as a mom, how would you describe it? Is it mundane? Like you feel like every day you're just waking up going through the motions. Like, what's the reason for this? What's the purpose in this? I know that, I hope God has a plan for them, but I just don't know. It's just tough right now. Maybe you would describe your meantime as a mom as like, it's just chaotic. It's just every day you feel like you're going in 15 different directions trying to hold your family together, and it's just hard. Moms, let me just say this. Every moment of motherhood may not be appearing to lead to anything significant, but every moment matters. Because God is doing something in these moments that feel mundane, these moments that feel chaotic, these moments where you might even feel like you're losing yourself at the expense of your children. These moments matter because God is doing something. And not just moms. Everybody, wherever you find yourself, dads, students, spouses, single people, working people, stay-at-home people, wherever you find yourself, whatever your meantime looks like, every moment, whether it's a good one or whether you are down in the depths of despair, every moment may not feel like it's leading to anything significant, but God is doing something in the future that you and I know nothing about. In fact, it's not our job to figure out what God is doing in the future. Here's what I want you to see about the future. The future is God's business until and only until He chooses to make it our business. There's nothing wrong with planning or dreaming about the future or setting goals in the future, but the future belongs to God. We're not given the keys to unlock the future, and so many of us get stuck here. We get stuck planning and dreaming about or trying to control the future, trying to set things up for God or orchestrate things so that we can have the outcome that we want in the future when it's in God's hands. God's in control of the future. Jesus even had something to say about this. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew 6:34. He says, so don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today's trouble is enough for today. Our job is not to figure out the future. Our job is to live in the meantime. And in the meantime, we are to be faithful to God. In that gap between God, what we hope God will do and what he actually does, we're called to be faithful in the meantime. Because if we're not faithful in the meantime, this is what we're going to miss. We're going to miss what God has for us, what he's orchestrating for us, what he's planning for us. And faithfulness opens our eyes to see the next step that God wants us to take in preparation for heading to the future. And Esther, in this short little book of the Bible, gives us the perfect example to follow for how we can remain faithful in the meantime, how we can learn to trust God one step at a time. So I want to point out 3 things that she did really quickly, just 3 things that she did in the meantime. And I'm telling you, if you do these 3 things, if you put these 3 things into practice, it will be a game changer for how you respond to God in the meantime. The first thing that Esther did with her meantime is she prayed. She prayed. Look at what it says in Esther 4, verse 16. She says, go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Pray for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. She prayed. That was her first response. She made her relationship with God a priority and went to him through prayer. She's thinking, all right, perhaps I've been made queen for such a time as this. Perhaps. So what's my next step? What do I do next? Where do I go? God, what do you want me to do? And she would not have known that had she not have prioritized her relationship with him through prayer. Through prayer. She did not run and hide. She did not become paralyzed with fear. She made prayer a priority. And prayer for you and I is it's us talking to God. We're communicating. We're having a conversation with God. We're talking to him. We're listening to him. Prayer is what aligns our heart with God's heart. It's what reminds us that God has a purpose for us. It's what reminds us that God will give us exactly what we need for today, for the meantime. And some of you have stopped talking to God in the meantime. Some of you have stopped having a conversation with God, and maybe you feel lost. Maybe you feel like you're just stuck. Wherever it is you find yourself, you're stuck. You need to talk to God. You need to make your relationship with him a priority so that you can figure out, okay, God, what is my next step? What do you want me to do? I want to align my thinking with your thinking. I want to align my heart with your heart. I need direction for what's next. And you've got to start having that conversation with God, because when we are communicating with God, our relationship with him is growing. And we are learning how to trust him through prayer. So not only did Esther pray in the meantime, she also prepared. She prepared. Look at what it says in Esther chapter 5, verse 4. She says, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king. This happened, we're told, on the 3rd day of the fast. On the 3rd day when the people were praying, she had already prepared a banquet. That meant that while she was praying, she was not sitting idle. She was not sitting on her hands, doing nothing, just saying, okay, God, answer my prayer, answer my prayer. No, she was doing something. She was preparing a banquet. Think about this. The Jewish people face annihilation, and her solution is to throw a dinner party. That's crazy. On the outside looking in, this is ridiculous. But because Esther made her relationship with God a priority through prayer, this is an idea that God put in her head that she may have otherwise missed had she not have gone straight to God. She was preparing. She was moving. And preparing for us is like this. Think about it like this. You are planning a 2-week dream getaway vacation to the Caribbean. Okay, that's a hint for my husband in case he's listening right now. You're planning a 2-week dream getaway vacation to the Caribbean. That suitcase at home in your closet, it's not going to get out and pack itself. You're going to have to pack the suitcase. You're going to have to prepare for the trip. You're going to have to prepare for the destination. That's what preparation looks like for us. Are you waiting on God to heal your broken marriage? Don't wait for your spouse to change. You become the spouse that you want them to be. You ask God, show me where I need to change. Show me areas in my life that I can work on, and you start working on them no matter the outcome, no matter what the future has. You prepare for the destination. Are you asking God for a new job or a career change? Don't wait for God to just drop that in your lap. You go out and you fill out as many job applications as you can in preparation for the destination. Esther didn't just pray in the meantime. She didn't just prepare in the meantime. She also proceeded. She stepped out in faith. She took one step of faith at a time. She moved forward. Look at what it says in verse 1. It says, on the 3rd day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace. It had been 30 days since she had seen the king or been summoned to the king. She had no idea if she was still in his favor or not. Haman had more relational equity with the king at this point in time or not, or more so than what Esther did. Esther stepped out not knowing where she was going to end up at the end of the day. I love that it says she put on her royal robes. Think about this. I get what she's doing here. As a woman, I get what she's doing because she realizes, you know what? I might die today, and if I die today, well, I'm gonna look good dying. Royal robes. This is her best dress right here. She stepped out, trusting God because she had prayed. She'd prioritized her relationship. She had prayed. She had prepared for the destination. Then when God shows her the next step to take, she steps out one step at a time, proceeding, following God. And some of you, that's what you need to do in your meantime today. In that gap between what you hope God will do and what he actually does, is you need to just step out and proceed. However God is calling you to move, whatever your next step is. Maybe you have been hearing God whisper to you for some time now, it is time for you to get out of that toxic dating relationship. But you've been too afraid to take that step because you're afraid of what the future holds. You don't know how it's going to turn out, and so you've just been stuck. It's time to put the future in God's hands. It's time to trust him with his plans and be faithful in the meantime and take that step and follow him. Maybe some of you parents have been putting off having that relationship with your son or daughter about their destructive life choices because you've been afraid of what might happen to the relationship as a result. It is time to step out in faith and put the future in God's hands because it's his business. He knows what's going to happen. He knows what's in front of us. We live in the meantime. All we have is what he gives us for today. And we're still talking about Esther thousands of years later because Esther made the choice to stay faithful to God and trust God, not knowing where she would land, even at the risk of her own death. We're still talking about her because she chose to make her relationship with God a priority. She prayed, she prepared, and she proceeded. And my hope for us is that when you walk out of this room, wherever you find yourself in the meantime, wherever, that you would make your relationship with God a priority, that you would trust him with the meantime, that you would put the future back in his hands, And that you would put these 3 P words, I made it really easy for you so that you wouldn't forget, that you would put these 3 P words into practice on a daily basis of just praying, preparing, and then proceeding. To just trust God in the meantime. Can you imagine what it would look like if LCBC became the kind of church, when people described this church, they said, man, this church is just full of faithful people. Like people from all walks of life. Whatever they're going through, they are faithful to God. I will tell you what would end up happening. We would change the world. We would change the world because we fully trust God. Trust God and be faithful in the meantime. Let's pray. God, I'm so grateful that the future does not belong to me. It does not belong to us. God, we would mess it up. And I'm so grateful that you are a God who has the future in his hands. You know what tomorrow holds. You know what's best for us. You have plans for us, plans for good and not for a disaster, plans to give us a hope and a future. God, you want to see us live our life abundantly to the fullest, the way that you meant for us to live our lives. God, teach us to be faithful to you in the meantime. Whatever may come, whatever may happen. We love you. In Christ's name, amen.